All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsor for this morning's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pei Hey 5785, the Tilson Mishpacha, for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this year in the Zechus B'Soros Tavos for all of Am Yisrael. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, in merit Hashem, all of the hostages should come home and our holy soldiers should be successful. B'chol ma'asei yedehim. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Samech Beis 62, and we are going to pick up on Samech Beis Amud Aleph 62a. We're going to pick up 2, 4, 5 lines down from the top. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Tani Rabbi Zakkai Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say, remember again, a very interesting sugya, well, a couple of interesting sugyas that we have in front of us today. So the Gemara says as follows. That camera angle is not right, but okay, it's good enough. Fine. So the Gemara says as follows. So Tani Rabbi Zakkai Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Zakkai taught the following halacha before Rabbi Yochanan. Listen to this. Zibeach v'kitar v'nisech v'ishtacha v'behelam echad. Okay, so an interesting avodah zarah case. So let's say someone goes ahead and worships an idol, and the way he worships it is zibeach. Zibeach means again offered up a carbon, slaughtered a carbon. Kitar, kitores, offered incense. Nisech, wine libations. Hishtachava, and he bowed. Now he did all of these things be'elam echad. So in other words, he did all of these things in one lapse of awareness. Now we're going to talk about exactly, now that is one doozy of a lapse, right? But again, we'll talk about exactly what that means, a lapse of awareness. A lapse of awareness of what? We'll get into that. But the point over here is that halacha l'maisa, that he's doing all of these things in this one moment. So multiple acts of avodah zarah. Thank you so much. Multiple acts of avodah zarah within one helam. So the Gemara says, "Einu chayiv ela achos." So the halacha is he's only chayiv once. So the chayiv once. So the Gemara. So again, it's important to get the names down over here. So this is Rabbi Zakkai saying over to Rabbi Yochanan. So the halacha is he did all of these things only chayiv once. So Amarlei puk tani lebra. So this is interesting. So Rabbi Zakkai says to Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan essentially says to him, "Get that out of the base medrash." Right? In other words, don't even tell me that. Get that statement out of the base medrash. Rabbi Abba, Hadar Rabbi Zakkai. So the Gemara says, so okay. So obviously, so remember, so Rabbi Yochanan did not take kindly to this particular statement. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Abba, Hadar Rabbi Zakkai, Machlokes Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Nassan. This statement of Rabbi Zakkai is in fact a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Nassan. What's the machlokes? Disanya havara lelavitas. So both say this is actually very interesting. Oh, okay. Shalom Aleichem, Chaver Eretz Yisrael. I see Moshe David over here. Meir Askis. Okay, Richard. Baruch Hashem. We have a nice Chaver from Eretz Yisrael. Touring Chavra, learning Chavra. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Shalom Aleichem, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you soon. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. All right, wow, have a great time. Enjoy. Beautiful. All right, so the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara wants to suggest that the statement of Rabbi Yochanan is in fact, the statement of Rabbi Zakkai is in fact a machlokes. What's the machlokes? The sanya. So we'll say this is one of the most yesodistic machlokesim we have in Hilchos Shabbos. We've seen it multiple times, and it's kedai to just see it once more. The sanya, havar l'lavitzas. Well, so here's what you know. Hilchos Shabbos. Where do we learn on Hilchos Shabbos? Where's Hilchos Shabbos learned from? Where's it learned from? Juxtaposition to the Mishkan. Now remember, interestingly enough, however, the Torah does go out of its way to say, Lo sevaru eish b'chol moshvoseichem b'yom HaShabbos. The Torah does say, do not kindle a fire in your home on Motzei Shabbos. On Motzei Shabbos. You could kindle a home in your fire on Motzei Shabbos. Go, please, go for that. Go for that. In other words, do not kindle a fire in your home on Shabbos. So the shaila is like this. A general shaila is, why does the Torah feel the need to single out Havara for Shabbos? In other words, remember, had the Torah remained silent, I would have said that just like fire was part of the process of the Mishkan, so to halacha l'maisa, you can't kindle a fire in your home on Shabbos. Why does the Torah feel the need to single out Havara? So this is a fundamental machlokes. So the Gemara says, Desanya Havara lelav yatzas Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says Havara was singled out, interestingly enough, to teach you that whereas every other Shabbos transgression is punished punishable by death if you go in and you kindle a fire. That is quote unquote only punishable by a lav. In other words, that the reason it's singled out is to create diminished liability. That's the understanding of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Nassim says, no, l'chalik yatsa. No, Rabbi Nassim says like this. Rabbi Nassim says, l'chalik yatsa means to teach you that there is individual liability for every Shabbos transgression. What does this mean? I'm going to thought like this. Hilchos Shabbos is like one lump of violation, right? One island of violation. And therefore, no matter what you do in Hilchos Shabbos, no matter how many transgressions you go ahead and you engage in, halacha l'maisa, there's only one liability. Kamash Malan, the Torah singles out Havara to teach us that halacha l'maisa, you are chayiv for each and every malacha that one performs. That's the chalik yatzasa. So now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about over here? So the Gemara says, L'man damar Havara l'lav yatzasa. So listen to this. According to the opinion that says that Havara was singled out, that whereas every other Shabbos transgression carries with a death penalty, Havara only carries with it a lav. So he'll say what? Hishtachava nami l'lav yatsa. Now, interestingly enough, there's a fascinating parallel here between Shabbos and Avodah Zarah. Because on one hand, the Torah tells us you can't worship Avodah Zarah, yet the Torah also singles out prostration, bowing down to Avodah Zarah. So once again, why single out prostration? Why single it out? So the Gemara says, L'mandam Havara l'lav yatzasa. So according to the opinion that says that Havara was singled out in order to make one chayiv for a lav, Hishtachava nami l'lav yatsa. So too prostration, right? Prostration, bowing down to an idol, was also singled out to tell you that what? That whereas normally worship of Avodah Zarah carries the death penalty, but prostration, bowing down, is only a lav. Okay, according to the opinion that says no, Havara was singled out in order to create individual liability for each and every malacha. He'll say that what? Hishtachava nami lechalik yatsa. So prostration was also singled out in order to go ahead and create individuated liability. Now, listen, remember again, why is this important for us? Because how did this whole Gemara start? The whole Gemara started with Rab Zakkai giving over a ruling before Rabbi Yochanan. What was the ruling? That if a person went ahead and offered up, slaughtered and sprinkled and libationized, right, and did all of these different things and bowed down to an idol, in one lapse, he's chayiv achos. He's chayiv once. So we're trying to figure out, now obviously, and Rabbi Yochanan did not take kindly to that teaching, so we're trying to figure out over here what exactly is it that is unfolding. So Rav Yosef, so the Gemara is suggesting maybe halacha l'maisa, that statement itself of Rabbi Zakkai is subject to machlokes. In other words, just like Shabbos, you have one malacha that was singled out. Why was the malacha singled out? So Rabbi Yosef says, in order to teach you that it's only a lav, whereas everything else is punishable by death. Rabbi Nassim was singled out to teach you that you're chayiv for each and every malacha individually. So too, let's say the same machlokes applies by Avodah Zarah. Why was prostration singled out? Why was it singled out? According to one opinion, in order to teach you that maybe whereas everything else in Avodah Zarah is punishable by death, prostration is punishable by a lav. Second opinion, no, to teach you that there's individual liability for each and every act of Avodah Zarah worship. So Gemara says, one second. So first of all, Rabbi Yosef comes along and says, maybe not. Maybe you can't actually align these things. Why not? Dilma ad kano kam Rabbi Yossi Hasam havar lelav yatzasa dinafkale chilik malachos me'achos mehina. So the Gemara says, first of all, maybe Rabbi Yossi only holds that Havara is different, right? That by Hilchos Shabbos, when the Torah singles out Havara, kindling, that halacha l'maisa is coming to single it out for a lav, because remember again, by Shabbos you have another pasuk. The pasuk that the Gemara is going to quote over here says, Daber al b'nei Yisrael lemar, nefesh ki techta bishgaga mikol mitzvos Hashem asher lo sa'asena, va'asa me'achos mehina. So the Torah is literally talking about, again, carbonic liability, a carbon chatos, right? That halacha l'maisa, and it says, if a person performs me'achos mehina. Now we're going to see that phrase as an interesting one, because the way it translates is me'achos from one, mehina from these. From one, from these. So the Gemara says, listen to this. The nafkalech, because chilik malachas, right? It could be that Rabbi Yossi holds that havara is singled out for lav purposes, because he learns out chilik malachas. He learns out the idea that every malacha is reckoned separately from a different source, namely from that phrase me'achas mehina. Desanya, so here we go, second wide line. Desanya, Rabbi Yossi says v'asa me'achas mehina. When the pasuk says, and he will perform, so this is talking about the violator, the person who's violating the halacha, he performs va'asa me'achas mehina. He does one of these things. So this is actually very interesting. Pamim shechayiv achas al kulan. We'll say sometimes you're only chayiv once for multiple acts of liability. The pamim shechayiv al kol achas va'achas, and sometimes you're chayiv multiple times for each and every act of liability. So we'll say, so again, this is a bit of a strange statement, but we'll explain in just a moment. So sometimes you could perform multiple acts and only be chayiv once, and sometimes you could perform multiple acts and be liable for each individual one. Again, we'll define what that is. So Rabbi Yochanan says, my time with Rabbi Yossi. Where does Rabbi Yossi get this from? Where does Rabbi Yossi get this from? Tiksiv v'asa me'achos mehina. Because the Torah, speaking about liability, says a person will perform one, me'achas from one, mehina from these. Now, interestingly enough, the juxtaposition of those two words, achas is singular, heina is plural. So now watch this. Achas, so the Gemara says, achas me'achas, heina mehina. So sometimes again, there's individual liability, achas me'achas. Sometimes there is collective liability, or I should say multiple levels of liability, heina mehina. And then achas shihi heina, veheina shi achas. And sometimes again, on both sides, there's achas shuheina, one act that could create multiple layers of liability, and veheina shi achas, and sometimes there are multiple acts that only result in one level of liability. So the Gemara says, for example, we'll say let's put the meat on the bones with this. So the Gemara says achos. So what would it be an example ultimately again of? Will be an example ultimately again of regular liability. So the Gemara says achos shimin. So for example, I'll say halacha l'maisa again. One example would be shimin, right? Shimin. Now what does it mean shimin? Oh, 1 second, sorry. Okay, what is it? For example, Hilchos Shabbos, a person goes ahead and writes shimin. So that's right. Remember again, one of the 39 malachas is writing. So you go ahead and you write the name Shimon. Okay, me'achos. Now, what does it mean me'achos? What would be an example of like a derivative malacha from that? Shem mi-Shimon. Let's say you instead of writing the name Shimon, you write Shin Mem. Shin Mem. Rabbi said we know that for Hilchos Shabbos purposes, right? One of the 39 malachos ultimately is kosev, is writing. How do you violate the malacha of ksiva? 2 letters. So that's an example. Interest. So again, so the malacha would be writing Shimon. What would be an example of me'ach? So for example, so again, just see what's happening over here. The Gemara is actually in the pasuk. So let's say again for Shabbos violation, me'achos. How do you violate Shabbos? Not really looking to violate Shabbos, but again, how does a person violate Shabbos? Me'achos. You write the name Shimon. Right, achos would be Shimon. Me'achos, what would be a derivative of that? So shem mi Shimon. You just write shemem. Heina refers to avos. Mehina refers to toldos. Remember again, in Hilchos Shabbos, you have the avos, which are what we call the primary categories of malacha. Those are the ones actually done in the Mishkan. And then you have the toldos, which are the derivative malachos. Achos shihi heina. So there was an example of achos, that is heina, was an example of one act, which could result in multiple layers of liability. For example, Zodon Shabbos v'shigagas malachos. So we'll say this is interesting. So Zadon Shabbos, what does this mean? I know that it's Shabbos, but I don't know that all of these acts that I'm engaging in are malachas. right? So I know that today is Shabbos, but what did I do? I figured, the cover Shabbos, I shech the cow. I didn't know that shechita was a malacha. Then I go ahead and I cook up a piece of meat. I didn't know that kindling a fire was a malacha. So I know that it's Shabbos. So I'll say, what's the halacha in that case? There's individual liability for each and everything that I do, right? So here, interestingly enough, there's, so to speak, so I know that it's Shabbos, but I don't know all of the malachas. There's individual liability. Zadon Shabbos Shigas Malachos. Hena Shiachos will be an example of multiple acts with individual liability. Shigagas Shabbos Vizadon Malachos. So I'll say, however, so interestingly enough, if I know that it's Shabbos, but I don't know that malachos are aser, I have liability for every malacha that I perform. On the other hand, if halacha l'maisa shigaga Shabbos, right? Again, that I don't know that it's Shabbos, v'zadon malachos, and ultimately, again, I am intentional about the malachos. So that's heina shi'achos. That would be, again, singular liability. So we'll say, so remember again, that's because you hear the difference over here. When I know that it's Shabbos, then again, so okay, every malacha that I perform is its own shogeg, and therefore generates its own liability. When I don't even know that it's Shabbos, right, and then I perform all of these malachas, my issue is not with malacha. What's my issue? Shabbos. And therefore, again, interestingly enough, as much as I've done multiple acts, there is singular liability for failure to know that it's Shabbos. Okay, interesting. Aval hocha, so we'll say, so now remember again, we're not learning Hilchos Shabbos. What are we learning? We're learning Avodah Zarah, right? Because remember again, how did this whole thing start? Remember, just to keep in mind our initial conversation. Reb Zakkai came before Rabbi Yochanan. What Reb Zakkai said? If a person performs all of these acts of worship of Avodah Zarah, behelam hechad, in one lapse, he's only chayiv once. So remember again, we're trying to figure out why that is and what exactly is the case. Avahacha, when it comes to Avodah Zarah, kivan zimers avahacha delo nafka lechilik malachos miduch ta'achrisi. So remember again, by Avodah Zarah, we don't have another source to teach us that halacha l'maisa, there is liability for each act of worship. The kule alma hishtachava lechalik yatsa. When the Torah singles out hishtachava, prostration is only singled out. Why? In order to create individuated liability. That halacha l'maisa, again, there is liability for each and every act of prostration. If that's the case, the Gemara says, "Chilik melachos da'avodas kochavim nami tepok le me'achas mehina." So the Gemara says, one second, why can't you use the same pasuk that we just quoted before for Avodah Zarah? Chilik melachos da'avodas kochavim nami. Right? Go ahead and learn out chilik melachos. Now, let's say what that means is learn out that each act of Avodah Zarah worship, one is going to be liable for that from Avodas Kochavim, from Avodah Zarah. Learn it out. Sefer Klei me'achas mehina. So, for example, we'll say same pasuk. Achas mehina, achas zvicha, me'achas zimin echad. So, for example, what would be achas? What would be a singular act of Avodah Zarah worship? Shechting an animal for Avodah Zarah. What's me'achas? What would be a derivative act of that? Shechting one siman. Now, what the Gemara is making a suggestion over here. If you remember again, halacha l'maisa, Shechita normally requires the cutting of both simanim, the windpipe and the esophagus. So let's say achas is the actual shechita. Me'achas would be cutting one of the simanim. Siman echad, heina, is avos. Therefore, the primary categories, zibuach, kitur, nisuch, ishtachava. So remember again, primary ways to worship Avodah Zarah. For example, slaughtering, burning incense, like wine libation, prostration, mehena, which is derivative. What does that refer to? Mehena toldos, shavar makel lefanel. For example, if you broke a stick in front of the Avodah Zarah, I will say, now breaking a stick, what does that mean? Let's say you have a particular type of Avodah Zarah where the way that you worship it is to break a stick. Okay, if that's the way you worship it, then that's the way you worship it. So the Lamaisa again, even though normally one would not be liable for that form of worship, but if halacha Lamaisa, that is how the particular idol is worshipped, then einachinami, there is liability for that. Achos shiyehena. What's an example of a singular act which can result in multiple layers of liability? For example, zadon avodos kochavim v'shigagas avodos. So we'll say that would be an example of, let's say again, I know Avodah Zarah is aser, but I don't know that all of these different things are problematic forms of worship. So for example, I know that I'm not allowed to worship Avodah Zarah, but I didn't know that I can't bow down to it, offer up a carbon to it, give incense to it. I didn't know all of these things. I committed all of these acts. So I'll say, what's the halacha? There's individual liability for each of those acts. Now remember again, mindset is everything. Because in this case, I knew Avodah Zarah was asur. What didn't I know? I didn't know like technical, logistical information. Okay? So you're chayiv. It's b'shogeg, obviously. All of this is shogeg. I'm chayiv for each and every act. So that would be the case of achos. In other words, there's achos shihena. So one act, or one situation which results in multiple layers of liability. Next, Heina Shi Achos. So we'll say, what would be an example of multiple acts only result in one level of liability? Shigagas avodos kochavim v'zadon avodos. That would be a case of where I didn't know that this thing wasn't avodah zarah, right? But I did all of these acts with intentionality. So again, in that case, there's multiple acts, but only one level of liability, because halacha l'maisa, I didn't know that it was an avodah zarah. Okay, so the Gemara says, by the way, Hai shigagas avodas kochavim heichi dami. So we'll say, this is a great question, and this harkens back to yesterday's daf. The Gemara says, tell me what it means to mistakenly worship avodah zarah. Just explain that one to me, right? What you slipped? What exactly happened over here? So Gemara said, listen to this. And we'll say this is yesterday's daf. We had this. So we'll say if you thought that the structure you were bowing down to was a shul, right? And what happened? And it turned out, and you bowed down to it, and it turned out that it was an avodah zarah. So we'll say that's not avodah zarah at all. Hari libo lashamayim. We'll say again, there a person's intention is totally pure. So there's no avodah. That's not even a shogeg avodah zarah, right? In other words, we'll say, which by the way, there happens to be this statement is so profound. Just so you understand, number one, the Gemara. Whoever heard of bowing down to a shul? Well, what like the Gemara seems to say about, let's say you see from something amazing, just the kavod that we are obligated to have towards a Beis HaKnesses, right? The kavod that we're obligated to have towards a shul, right? A shul, a mikdash ma'at, is the home of the Ribono Shel Olam, and how we are obligated to treat it with respect and with reverence and with derech eretz and with love. It's fascinating. Whoever heard of bowing down to a shul? What is that? And obviously, we don't bow down to a shul, but it's interesting that the Gemara understands this as well. If you thought it was a shul, and therefore you bow down, as if that's a normal thing to do. So again, we see this all the time in Gemara, how Chazal teach us such profound yisodos, such profound yisodos, just again in the give and take of the Gemara. So the other piece over here also is the Gemara says, if you thought it was a shul, you bow down to it. Hari libo lashamayim. Your heart belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I will say that phrase. If at the end of the day, when your children or friends or whoever's going to deliver your eulogy, if they could say that phrase about us, that this was a person whose libo was lashamayim, his heart belonged to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If after 120 they could say that about you, that is a life well lived. That you learn Torah, anybody can learn Torah. That you gave tzedakah, if you have it, you're going to give it. You did chesed, it's beautiful and fulfilling, and it's shtickle self-serving to give chesed. It feels so good to do it. What's the true metric of spiritual success? A person who lives a life where his heart belongs to the Ribono Shel Olam. Rachmana liba boy. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants more than anything from us is not our body. He doesn't just want our mechanistic activities. He wants our hearts. He wants our hearts. So you could say, Hari libo lashamayim. Imagine if HaKadosh Baruch Hu could say that about me, if my family could say that about me after 120. Hari libo, my heart belonged to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, you obviously have to bring the rest of your body along with your heart as well, right? It doesn't make it, you're not allowed to say the alarm went off in the morning. My heart belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? My body is going to belong to the bed, right? But my heart belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Obviously, you need the body to follow the heart. But I will say, but sometimes, we get so lost in all of the mechanistic details that we forget that as important as the details are not the ends. The details are the means to bring my heart to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ella, so what's the case? Ella dechaza andarta v'sagile. What's the case? The case where we saw yesterday's daf. I saw a statue of the king. What did I do? I bowed down to it. So the Gemara says, "I kabli alei." If I kabli alei mezu. Well, 1 second. If you bow down to a statue because you thought that it was a god, that's avodah zarah. So what are we talking about over here? Ilo kabli alei. If you did not accept it as a deity, lo klumu. Then ultimately, again, there's nothing to talk about. Ella me'avo me'ira. You both say again. Rather, remember again. This was yesterday's daf. Rather, why did I bow down to the statue? Out of fear or love for a person. Nothing to do with the statue. Nothing to do with the statue. Both say. Remember again. What was the example of yesterday's daf? Haman. This is why, by the way, that let's say you ever wonder the Megillah says Mordechai lo koreh mishtachave. Mordechai didn't bow down, which tells you everyone else was bowing down, including the Rabbanim, including the Talmidei Chachamim. How were they able to do it? It wasn't avodah zarah. It wasn't avodah zarah. That was the whole chap. They were doing it ultimately again because they were scared of Haman. They were doing it out of respect or reverence to Haman or fear of Haman. It wasn't avodah zarah. That's why again the Gemara Megillah records that there was such animosity between Mordechai and the other Rabbanim because the other Rabbanim thought that Mordechai was a rabble rouser. They thought he was a troublemaker. What are you doing? Just bow down. Everyone else is bowing down. Why do you got to be the guy who doesn't bow down? Right? It's not avodah zarah. We're bowing down out of coveting year. This is not theological. This is not theological at all. This is just about playing the game of politics. So the Gemara says as follows. Now 1 second. So according to Abaye, that says that if you bow down to a statue out of Avon Yira, you're chayiv. But Rava says that it's pater. So what is there to say? So the Gemara says, Ella ba'omer mutter. Interestingly enough, rather I will say, what's the case? The case is where a person says it's mutter to worship avodah zarah. Omer mutter. Rashi says over here, it's 5 lines up from the bottom. Ela ba'omer mutter, kasavra ein avodas kochavim batorah. He'll say the person says there's no prohibition of avodah zarah in the Torah. He mamish thinks that. That's what happens when you don't pay attention in shir. Right? In other words, literally again, there's no omer mutter. It's mutter. He'll say, by the way, I just want to point out, lest you think that this is so crazy, right? The truth is, all of us tend to do this in some area of Yiddishkeit, right? Omer mutter. I said it's mutter. I bet it's not, but I said it is. It's powerful, right? It's powerful, right? We are powerful people. Omer mutter. I said that it's mutter. If you say, and by the way, if you say it enough times and you say it convincingly enough, something amazing happens, which is you actually begin to believe it, right? We're able to live. One of the interesting things that Kadosh Baruch Hu has programmed us is with the ability to live with cognitive dissonance. I could create alternative realities, and when you live them and reinforce them for long enough, they actually become emes. So the Gemara says, Omer mutter. Guy says, avodah zarah is mutter. I didn't know. So the Gemara says, Tifshot debaymnei Rav Merav Nachman, Helam zev zeb yadamau. So I'll say, interestingly enough, now if you're going to tell me Omer mutter is potter, so interestingly enough, this helps me resolve another case. What's the other case? Helam zev zeh. Let's say a guy didn't know about avodah zarah and he didn't know about any of the accompanying modes of worship. What's the halacha? Tifshot de'eno chayiv ela achos. So it would appear that ultimately, again, he would only be chayiv once. So the Gemara says, they don't chayiv elachos. Halo kasha, v'tivshot enachinam. There shouldn't be a question. I resolve it. Now 1 second. Let's go back for a second. We were darshaning achas mehina to apply to avodah zarah, but can you really go ahead and darshan these psukim to apply to avodah zarah? Dilu hacha ksiv b'mashiach par. Dilu ksiv b'mashiach par ubenasi seir ubiyachid kivsa usira. Because again, in all of these different levels of liability, you have the par coin Mashiach, which is a par, the offering, the guilt offering, if the nasi rules erroneously. Right, that's a seir, and for an individual, it's a kivsa seira. Filu ba'avodas kachavim yet by idolatry tnan v'shavin shebeseira kiyachid. Ultimately, again by avodah zarah, I'll say the Gemara taught that halacha l'maisa they offers up a seir like the individual. Okay, so the Gemara says. Rashi points out over Ilu ba'avodos kochavim tanya le'el v'shavin Rebbe v'chachamim shekayim Mashiach b'sir kiyachid. The Gemara says, and the Gemara concludes this discussion, v'su lo midi. There is nothing more to discuss regarding this particular topic. Now look at the last Rashi in the daf. V'su lo midi leka l'shinui midi hilchach lo nafka lo nchilik malachas ba'avodos kochavim mehacha el mishtachava kidas kafta d'Rav Yosef. So bottom line, the Gemara says over here is that halacha l'maisa. Interestingly enough, there is a similarity between Shabbos and Avodah Zarah. What's the similarity? What Shabbos say, by the way, the similarity between Shabbos and Avodah Zarah, actually, the Gemara says quite explicitly that whoever is mechalal Shabbos, it's as if he is worshiping Avodah Zarah, right? Shabbos is the mitzvah that solidifies and concretizes our belief in God as a creator. That without that, there is no belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The primary essence of the Ribono Shel Olam is as a historical and contemporary creator. Shabbos is the day that solidifies that, right? We abstain from creative activity in order to yield that creative baton to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, again, failure to observe Shabbos is tantamount to worship of Avodah Zarah. The Gemara now takes that comparison a step further, just to teach us, although it's from two different sources, that just like Shabbos, the Torah goes out and singles out kindling in order to show you that there is individual liability for every act of Chol Shabbos. So to the Torah singles out prostration by Avodah Zarah to teach us that there's individual level of liability for every act of worship of Avodah Zarah. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Ki azar of Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar." So we'll say Amud Beis. Hachi Tana Kame Chomer b'Shabbos mishar mitzvos. Chomer b'shar mitzvos mi b'Shabbos. So supposed to listen to this. There's a chumrah that Shabbos has over other mitzvahs, and there is a chumrah that other mitzvahs have over Shabbos. Okay, here we go. Chomer b'Shabbos. What's the chumrah of Shabbos? 3 lines down on 62b. Samapay Zamad Chomer b'Shabbos. Shabbos also shtayim behelam echad. Chayav akol achas v'achas. So we'll say, okay. So now we'll read it, and then we're going to define our terms in a little bit. In Shabbos, if you committed 2 malachas behelam echad. Now, what does that mean? 2 malachas in 1 lapse. In 1 lapse. Now, again, we'll have to discuss exactly what kind of lapse we are talking about over here. What's the lapse? Now, by Pashtos, what it sounds like, well, we'll discuss. So, Asa Shtayim Behelam Echad, if you went ahead and you did 2 malachas in 1 lapse of awareness, Chayiv Akal Achas V'Achas. You are Chayiv for each individual malacha. So, again, there's a lapse. Good. The Gemara says, Masha'ein Kain B'Shar Mitzvahs. Now, that is not true by other mitzvahs. So apparently, by other mitzvahs, if a person commits 2 transgressions, let's say in 1 lapse of awareness, you're only going to be Chayiv once. Okay, now let's analyze. On the other hand, chomer b'shar mitzvahs. On the other hand, other mitzvahs have liability over Shabbos. How so? Sheb'shar mitzvahs. When it comes to other mitzvahs, shagag below miskavein chayiv. This is very interesting. If you accidentally perform a malacha or an avera without kavana, you are going to be chayiv. Masha'ein came b'Shabbos. This is not true by Shabbos. Now, this is very interesting. So, I'm going to introduce. We'll just talk about a particular term which we've seen before. What this refers to is misasek. We're going to see when it comes to accidental violation of a malacha. There's 2 different ways that could occur. There's typical shogeg. Now, what's typical shogeg? Typical shogeg is, for example, let's say Hilchos Shabbos. I know that it's Shabbos. I didn't know that turning on a light was asur. For example, right? So I know that it's Shabbos, I'm shogeg. There's another thing called misasek. Misasek means I am involved in a totally different act, actually potentially a permitted act. And as a result of that act, something prohibited occurs. Meaning, whereas if you take a look at the light case, right, I had kavanah to turn on the light, right? What was my mistake? I didn't know you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. That was my mistake. So again, there was kavanah for the act, but just a lack of awareness for what it is I was doing. Misasek, as we'll see in just a moment, means I didn't have kavanah to do anything wrong. It just happened to be, as a result of what I was doing, something else occurred which was prohibited. So now, we'll come back to it in just a moment. So the Gemara says, we'll go back. Chomer b'shar mitzvos. So there is a chumrah of other mitzvos over Shabbos, and that's what? Sheb'shar mitzvos, shagag below miskavein chayiv. Ultimately, again, if you go out and you do a shogeg without kavana, you're chayiv. Masha'in came b'Shabbos. By Shabbos, if there's no kavana for the act, you're not chayiv. Right? So in other words, if you do an act without any level of intention, Shabbos requires intentionality. So by other mitzvahs, if you perform an Aveira even without intentionality, you're going to be chayiv. By Shabbos, you're only chayiv with intentionality. So let's analyze this. So the Gemara says, for example, Amar Mar, let's now dissect this. Amar Mar, Chomer b'Shabbos. So what's the Chomer of Shabbos? Sheb'Shabbos asa shtayim. So remember again, what did we just say? On Shabbos, if you performed 2 malachas, behel lamechad, in one lapse, then what's talacha? You're chayiv for each and every malacha. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Heichi dami. What's the case? This is fascinating. Okay, so let's say on Shabbos, maybe you went ahead and you violated. So Shabbos morning, right? You went ahead and you harvested. You harvested and you ground the wheat. Right. So those are 2 different malachas: harvesting and grounding. So let's say you did both of those things. Some people will do anything not to go to shul on time, right? So you go ahead, right? You harvest, and you grind up the wheat. So 2 different malachas. So what will be a comparison, let's say, out of Hilchos Shabbos? What will be a comparison, not Hilchos Shabbos? For example, da'achal chelev v'dam. So let's say, Rabbi say again, the parallel case would be, you ate forbidden fat and blood. Okay, so just like by Shabbos, Katsira and Techina, 2 malachas, you're doing those things in one lapse. So too, you're eating forbidden fat and blood. Okay, so the Gemara says, Hacha tarti mechayiv. I don't know. In both of those cases, it makes sense that there be dual liability. And I was supposed to remember again, the Gemara said before, that Shabbos has a chumrah over other averos. How so? Or other mitzvahs. That by Shabbos, if you performed 2 acts in one lapse, you're chayiv twice. Whereas for other averos, you'll only be chayiv once. But the Gemara says that's not true. By Shabbos, let's say I go and I do Katsira and Techina in one lapse. Okay, so the parallel case would be I eat blood and chaylev in one lapse. So by Shabbos it should be chayiv twice. But if you eat blood and fat, they both say, what's the halacha? You should also be chayiv twice. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Ella, listen to this. Gabi shar mitzvahs de'eno chayiv ella achas hechi dami. What would be a parallel case by other mitzvahs that you would only be chayiv once? What would be the case? Listen to this. The Gemara says, da'achal chaylev v'chaylev. Oh, interesting enough, I will say, where I eat 2 kizesim of chaylev in one lapse of awareness. Can't get enough of that chaylev. Right? So we'll say, so what happens? I eat 2 pieces of chaylev in one lapse of awareness. So we'll say, so apparently in that case, you'd only be chayiv once. So we'll say, yeah, by Shabbos, if you were to perform 2 acts of harvesting, right? Harvesting 1, and then go back and harvesting 2, that there would be dual liability for that. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. That's not true. That's not true. That's not true. By Shabbos also, if you were to do 2 acts of harvesting, right, in quick repetition of each other, you'd also only be chayiv once. Now, by the way, this is why you see that Rabbi Yochanan told Rabbi Zakkai to get this teaching out of here, right? That in other words, he didn't like this memory. He did not feel that this actually made any sense. So Mar says, I don't understand. My kushya, what's the problem over here? Listen to this. So listen to this. So let's go back to our original case. The case in Hilchos Shabbos, where if you perform 2 acts in one helam, that there's dual liability. What's the case? Like we said before, it's Shabbos morning, I harvest the wheat and I grind it, right? 2 malachas. Now again, all of this is in one lapse, but Pashtos, what's the lapse? I didn't know that it's Shabbos. I did not know that it's Shabbos. I didn't know that it's Shabbos. I'm harvesting, I'm grinding, so there's going to be dual liability in this. Okay, so now, what would be the corresponding case? Let's say by another Aveira, where in one lapse, 2 acts only results in singular liability. What would be that case? Listen to this. Kid Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami said, Zibeach v'kiter v'nisech behelam echad eino chayiv ela achas. Oh, okay, here it is. Rabbi Ami says, if you slaughter If you slaughter, right, offer incense, offer libations, you do all of these things for Avodah Zarah, all in one lapse of awareness. What's the halacha? You only chayiv once. You only chayiv once. So I will say, what do you see from it? An interesting contrast. So by Hilchos Shabbos, if you perform multiple malachas in one lapse of awareness, you're chayiv for each and every performance. On the other hand, by Avodah Zarah, if halacha l'maisa you perform multiple acts of worship in one lapse, you're only chayiv once. To which the Gemara says, no, you can't set this up with Avodah Zarah. Why not? Tiktani Seifa, because look at the end of the Brisa. Chomer b'shar mitzvahs, right? So we'll say, so that's the chumrah of Shabbos over other mitzvahs. That's the Gemara suggesting. But what was the end of the Brisa? The other Brisa was that there's a chumrah of shar mitzvahs, a chumrah of shar mitzvahs over Shabbos. How so? Shebeshar mitzvahs shagag b'lo miskavein chayiv. Well, so listen to this. Remember again, by other mitzvahs, if you perform an accidental act, even without kavanah, there's liability. However, again, shagag b'lo miskavein. So however, by Shabbos, remember again, by Shabbos, what was the halacha? If you do shogeg without kavanah, you're pater. Right? Shabbos requires kavanah. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Shogeg below miskavim b'avodas kochavim heichi dami. So Rabbi say, what is shogeg below kavana? What is that case? What's a case of accidental avodah zarah without kavana? That there be liability for that. Heichi dami. Here we go once again. If I bow down to a building and I thought the building was a shul, right? But it turned out that it was really avodah zarah. That's not avodah zarah at all. Why? Harili b'la shamayim. Because as we said before, again, my intentions are pure. My intentions are absolutely pure. Ela dahavi andarta v'sagile. Both says exactly what we said before. Rather, what's the case? The case is where I bow down to a statue. I bow down to a statue. Ikable ale beloka. Say if I'm bowing down to the statue as a god, mezitu. Then again, that's a mezid. Ve'ilo kable ale. But if I did not accept it as a god, then lo klumhi. Then I will say it's nothing. Then l'mais it's absolutely nothing. Ella me'ava v'yira. Rather, what must be the case? The case we must be talking about over here is where I'm bowing down to the idol, but I'm bowing down to it ultimately again out of love or fear for a particular individual. So once again, hani chala bayid damar chayiv. So that makes sense. According to Abaye, says that there's liability for such an act. El Rav damar pater ma'ikal meimar. But according to Rav, who says that's your pater, what is there to say? Ella ba'omer mutter. Rather, I will say, what's the case? The case ultimately again is where the person thinks that it is mutter to worship idolatry. That's the case. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so apparently Omer Mutter will create some level of liability by Avodah Zarah, but ultimately, again, by Shabbos would be Pater Legamre. Now again, we'll see if that's true, that's true Halacha L'Maisa or not. Adkan, Lo Ba'bnei Rav Nachman Helam Zeh V'Zeh. So remember, up until this point, Adkan Lo Ba'bnei Rav Nachman Helam Zeh V'Zeh. Up until this point, Rav was only asking Rav Nachman about Helam Zeh V'Zeh. In other words, where there was a lapse of awareness on both areas. As I both say, just to be clear, the question of liability was always a very simple question. Are you going to be chayiv once, or are you going to be chayiv multiple times? That was the question. Pater legamre lekal mandamar. No one says, or I should say, the Gemara asks really as a question: is there anyone who says that there is complete liability, complete exemption? Is there anyone who would say that you're totally pater for anything? To which the Gemara says, well, why not? My kushya, dumali olam locha reisha ba'avodas kochavim v'seifa b'shar mitzvos. Maybe we're saying the following: the reisha is talking about avodah zarah, the seifa is talking about other mitzvos, and how so? V'shagag b'lo miskavin. And what are we talking about over here? We're talking about a case of an accidental commission of an avera without kavanah. Now watch this. Tekasavar, what would be an example of that? I both said, for example, what would be an example by a general avera of shogeg without kavana? See, here it is. Roku ubalo. So we'll say, here's what it is. There happens to be a piece of chaylev in my mouth. I forgot that there's chaylev in my mouth. I just think it's saliva. So what do? I swallow it. See, a typical shogeg case is where I know what I'm doing, but I don't know that it's aser. This case is a little bit different. In this case over here, I don't even have kavanah for the act of eating chaylev. Right? In other words, it's one thing to have kavanah to eat chaylev, but just to be ill-informed and think that consumption of chaylev is mutter. In this case over here, I have something in my mouth. I forgot that it was chaylev. I just thought it was excess saliva, so I swallow it. So there I will say, there's not even kavana. There's not even kavana. The kasavar, that's shagag below miskavin. The kasavar, roku bolo. Now I will say, now halacha l'maisa, you're chayiv in that case. You're chayiv in that case. So remember again, we're creating a contrast between Shabbos and Shar Averos. So by other Averos, I will say, even if you have absolutely no kavana for the commission of the Avera, but you do it, there's liability. I forgot that there's chaylev in my mouth. I thought it was saliva. I swallow it. I have absolutely no kavana for any chaylev consumption. That's fine, right? But I'm still chayiv. Interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Masha'enkin b'Shabbos, the pater. So I will say Shabbos is going to be pater. If you don't have kavana for the act by Shabbos, you're pater. Why not? The Gemara says, for example, shinis kavin lahagbias atalush v'chatach es hamechuber. Pater. Well, it's a fascinating case. Let's say on Shabbos, I go out, there's a cucumber on the ground. So I want to make a salad. I'm going to pick up the cucumber, and I figure to myself that cucumber is detached. So because it's detached, therefore again it's mutter for use. It turns out I pick it up and I end up plucking it out of the ground, which is one of the malachos. So I will say, interestingly enough, on Shabbos you are pater. You are pater for that. Now why? So Rabbi say, because we're going to see, the Gemara says, Kid Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. This is because Rav Nachman Amar, Hamisasik bechalavim uba'arayos chayiv shekin nene. So Rabbi say, listen to this. Misasik. Now remember again, what's misasik? Misasik means I am involved in a permitted act. But what ends up happening is I end up doing something prohibited. For example, by the chaylev cases, what we just saw, there was a piece of chaylev in my mouth. I totally forgot about it. I just thought it was saliva. I swallow it. That's the case of misasik. As far as I'm concerned, I am ready to go ahead and do something totally permitted, but it turns out to be something prohibited. There's still liability for that. Interestingly enough, same thing by arayos, by immorality. All right, so this is an interesting one, right? Where again, I have kavanah to do something permitted, but it turns out that something prohibited happens. So for example, let's say Ruvain is ready to have relations with his wife, Rachel, but it turns out through some confluence of events that he ends up having relations with Rachel's sister. He slipped, right? So I might say again, but again, I will say, but it's, in other words, some type of mistake occurred, right? And he ends up having relations with the wrong woman. But again, that was not at all his intentions. There was no intentionality of it. Interestingly enough, lack of intentionality. I feel like people say that all the time by arayos, right? So I might say again, but in this case, legitimately, his intention was to have relations with his wife. Through some confluence of events, he ends up having relations with the wrong woman. I mean, I don't know how exactly he's going to explain that to his wife, right? But lamaisa, that's not our problem for today. Right? So again, by all other averos, this is interesting. By all other averos, lack of intentionality still results in liability. By Shabbos, and here it is, by Shabbos, meleches machsheves asra Torah. I will say, when it comes to Shabbos requires meleches machsheves. Meleches machsheves means intentionality. By Shabbos, there has to be intentionality for the act, and if there is no intentionality, there is absolute exemption. Absolute exemption. That's why when you go to pick up the cucumber, thinking that the cucumber was detached, and it turns out that you lift it up and you just plucked it out of the ground, there's no liability for that because you need melechas machshava. So we'll say, so interesting, so we'll have to stop over here for today. But what it turns out is halacha l'maisa, these fascinating distinctions. So first of all, the one thing that you do have commonality about is that there is individuated liability, just like for Shabbos. You also have that by Avodah Zarah. Which the difference between, and again, same thing by Shabbos and Avodah Zarah, is that you can be chayiv for multiple individuated liability. An interesting distinction, however, is by all other averos, I will say, even lack of intentionality results in liability. By Shabbos, only with intentionality is there their liability. For today, our Yarchei Kal is leaving for Eretz Yisrael Eretz Hashem this afternoon. Flight is tonight, so I'll be there in Eretz Yisrael. But Shir will go on, so we'll be broadcasting the Shir back here. And I thank Avi Fogel, who is going to be taking over our technology logistics over here while our logistics team is on site in Eretz Yisrael. So the Shir is going to be broadcast here every day. Eretz Hashem, obviously not Shabbos, but we'll still keep going strong in Eretz Hashem. 2 chavros, one here, one Eretz Yisrael. Halavai. We'll all be Zocha Eretz Hashem to join together for Shir Eretz Yisrael B'Karov. No, so that's the difference. So no, you can't. You're not allowed to use it because it's a result of malacha. But there's not liability.
It was an old joke about shul became a church.